So it is a delight to have you all here. I'm very happy to turn the mic now over to Dr. Val Percival, who I think all of you will know as an associate professor and associate director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, to take us on this journey. Val.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Khalil, not for just hosting this event, but also for your tremendous leadership on development issues in Canada. And I'd also like to thank Rachel for her excellent job in organizing this event and for her support. And thanks to all of you for coming out. Do I have a clicker or is it? Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Sorry. So we're, as Khalil mentioned, I'm presenting the results of a consultation exercise on Canada's engagement in context of development, fragility, and violence. And we're arguing that Canada can move the needle to improve development and humanitarian outcomes. And we're suggesting two kind of immediate measures. First, Canada can and should use the convening power of its G7 presidency to lead a G7 working group on development and humanitarian assistance. And secondly, to effectively lead that discussion, Canada needs to articulate a new framework to guide its engagement in fragile, conflict-affected, and developing contexts. And we also, fundamentally argue that these actions will both strengthen Canada and enable it to contribute to a more peaceful and prosperous world. So in terms of our approach, this was a rapid, off the side of the desk kind of exercise. From February to April, NPSIA convened a series of focus groups on Canada's engagement in contexts of development, fragility, and conflict. And some of you who are here participated in those workshops and focus groups, and I'm very grateful. We were motivated by the growing levels of poverty and human suffering that we're seeing around the world, caused by the escalating level of conflict, economic disruptions, as well as this massive cutbacks in development assistance by the United States and other key donors. We were also motivated by Canada's relative silence in the face of ongoing humanitarian and development crises, as well as its, what some describe as lackluster track record on official development assistance. And we were thirdly motivated by the new government that presents an opportunity for a new start and a new vision. So as I mentioned, our approach, we weren't funded. We ran these focus groups under Chatham House rules. The limitations were that it was a rapid exercise. It was largely Ottawa-based. And any shortcomings that remain are mine. The objective really was to put something on the table and start to provoke discussion and debate. And I'm grateful for all of you for being here to help with that. So as all of you know, the global context is increasingly challenging. Levels of poverty remain high. They had begun to diminish in 2023, but they rose again in 2024. We're seeing incredibly high levels of conflict and violence. Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine are examples of that. A disruptive United States led by President Trump has upended the liberal Western order and liberal institutions. His focus on America first is also having a contagion effect around the world. There's been massive cuts to official development assistance, not only in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, in Netherlands, and other countries. Multilateral organizations and global cooperation, when it's needed most, is under extreme strain. In terms of the Canadian context, we have this new government that has promised to maintain current levels of official development assistance, but we're seeing an overwhelming focus on security, on border security, on our military, on global security alliances such as NATO, economic security, and all of this is important. We need to be clear-eyed regarding the threats that we face. But the dominance of security approaches does have dangers. It tends to divide the world into who we perceive shares our values and warrants protection, and those who do not. We become preoccupied with the security of the state, of citizens, and of our allies. Also, the circle of advisors engaged in foreign policy discussions narrows, and there tends to be a lack of diversity of views at the table. State institutions are mobilized to identify, deter, and eliminate short-term threats to security, so it's a very short-term approach, without really undertaking sufficient efforts to understand, manage, and mitigate the long-term drivers of security issues. So in the report, we talk about how we think about the world mattering. So Canada has traditionally framed its development and humanitarian engagement as a reflection of Canadian values. However, given the challenging geopolitical context and the domestic pressures fiscally that we're under, the report argues that we need to articulate how development and humanitarian assistance also serve Canadian interests. So when you look at Canadian interests and interest-based foreign policy, there's kind of two ways you can look at it. You can look at it very narrowly, i.e. a strong Canada protected from global threats, or you can look at it more broadly. Global engagement contributes to a more peaceful and prosperous world. And the frame that you select, either the narrow or the broad frame, really reflects how we see the world and our place in it. So if we assume that Canada can benefit from international engagement and insulate itself from global threats, our focus becomes solely on building a strong Canada in the world. If we recognize that national economic, social, and political systems can't be disconnected from global systems, our view of Canada's roles and obligations in the world shifts. So it's obvious that the report argues that Canada cannot insulate itself from global threats. We saw this most clearly during the COVID pandemic. A crisis in one part of the world quickly spreads across global systems. So the Cascade Institute in British Columbia does a lot of work on the kind of polycrisis approach. So while interconnectedness brings threats, importantly, it also brings opportunities, and improved outcomes can cascade across systems. So clearly contributing to a more peaceful and prosperous world is in Canada's national interest, because we can move the needle. In other parts of the world, it can cascade and have an influence here. So you might be wondering why I have a picture of a ship during the Blue Nose ship. So when I talk to students about foreign policy, I often use the analogy of a ship. You need a strong ship. You need a clear idea of where you're going, a vision. You need good navigation equipment. You need a leader with experience and expertise to be able to navigate potentially rocky seas, and you need an excellent crew. And so I think the Blue Nose ship is a good analogy for Canada's place in the world. The Blue Nose emerged after the end of World War I, when the world was facing similar disruptions as it is today. It was a small but mighty ship that a consortium of Canadians built. It was fast. It was able to outmaneuver American ships. It was adaptable, and it was resilient. So I think this serves as a kind of good analogy for how Canada should, and it was also ambitious, how Canada should think about potentially navigating the world. So when we think about how we do that, what tools we have at our engagement, the focus group discussions talked about several of these tools. So obviously you have diplomacy, you have norm development, you have our engagement in the group of 7, you have official development assistance, also development financing. We can leverage our role in multilateral organizations, and we can work with a diverse set of allies in order to maximize our impact. It's also important to recognize that we have networked diplomacy tools at our disposal. We can mobilize Canadians both here, abroad, through diaspora communities, et cetera. So these are our various tools of engagement that we talk about in the report. So we come up, I recognize my time is limited and we want to get to discussion. So we come up with kind of two recommendations for the new government that emerged through our focus group discussion. And at the heart of these recommendations is the pragmatic understanding that Canada needs to accomplish more with roughly the same level of resources. So it needs to do its global engagement more efficiently and effectively. So the first of our recommendations relates to the G7, which is coming up really quickly. At the G7 meeting in Kananaskis, we argue that Canada should announce that it will lead a special G7 working group on international responses to development and humanitarian challenges. This actually is a nice bookend because in the previous Kananaskis G7 meeting that was hosted in 2001, I believe, Prime Minister Chrétien used this opportunity to launch an initiative on Africa. So this would be a really nice bookend. We argue that the G7 working group should review development and humanitarian aid architecture, including multilateral assistance, and outline proposals for reform. The UK Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, recently proposed a global conference on the future architecture of aid, and one of our focus group participants suggested that that was something that Canada should do. Canada should host this conference and, in collaboration with the G20, use it as an opportunity to discuss the G7 proposals to reform that emerged from this working group discussion. So that's one of the things that we're suggesting. In order to effectively engage in those G7 discussions, however, we argue that Canada needs a new framework for engagement. To go back to the blue nose analogy, we need to be sailing in a good ship and with a good crew and with a clear direction. So through these focus groups discussions that we had, some clear principles, goals, and potential initiatives emerged that I'd like to share with you today. And the focus of this is really to get a conversation going. It's not to propose definitive solutions, but it's to get that conversation started. But before I do that, I wanted to reflect on Canada's feminist international assistance policy. Through our focus group discussions, the strengths of the FIAP came up repeatedly. The FIAP shone a light on the critically important role that gender equality plays in development and peace outcomes. And I had recently done a Lancet commission on the role of gender equality in contributing to peace, and you can find that on the table outside. The FIAP strengthened gender equality architecture within Global Affairs Canada and around the world. It supported civil society activists in difficult places. It provided funding for critically important evidence-based gender equality interventions. And our approach to development and humanitarian assistance was really strengthened by this gender equality architecture. However, development policy needs to, particularly given the current challenges that we face, development policy needs to be flexible, adaptable, and responsive, with a focus on diagnosing all the problems, not just implementing solutions. So development policy can't sit on a pedestal. It needs pillars. And so while gender equality needs to be a really strong pillar of Canada's development and humanitarian policy going forward, it can't be the only one. We need kind of a different and broader approach. So through the focus group discussions, some principles for our new framework kind of emerged that I summarize here. So first, our global engagement should further human rights, dignity, and well-being, and boost economic and social potential. Second, we need to focus on action and results to move the needle. So in this time of scarce resources, Canada's development and humanitarian assistance needs to be evidence-based and deliver benefits to recipient populations. And third, countries themselves should really be in the driver's seat of their own development. So those are our principles. In terms of the goals of any new framework for Canada's engagement in conflict-affected and fragile states, as well as developing contexts, we identify several. So first, civilian protection and human rights. So under the human security agenda, civilian protection was a kind of a cornerstone of that initiative, and we think it's time to bring it back. Given the number of conflicts and the impact that those conflicts have on civilian populations, Canada needs to work to protect these civilians from the impact of organized violence. Second, poverty reduction, which is outlined in our Official Development Assistance Act. We need to ensure access to basic needs, improve living standards, and contribute to inclusive economic growth. We also need to boost human capital and adopt a capabilities approach by providing access to education, training, and skills development. We need to, as mentioned earlier, ensure that gender equality is a strong pillar to ensure that everyone, regardless of gender, benefits from the ability to develop these human capabilities. We need a strong approach on sustainability to minimize the environmental impact of development and humanitarian interventions and strengthen climate adaptation and resilience. And finally, we need to strengthen public institutions and civil society organizations to contribute to good governance, to enable the rule of law, the delivery of effective public services, and ensure transparency and accountability. So we talked through the focus group discussions, several mechanisms to achieve these goals emerged. So we identify by several here. So first, we need a bureaucracy that gets it done. So our bureaucracy, including global affairs, needs to be much more nimble and effective. It needs to prioritize expertise and real-world experience. Decision-making should be devolved, including financial authorities. There's been a lot of focus on foresight research, which I think is really important. We need to think about the threats that we face. But I get a little bit frustrated because that foresight research never identifies the evidence-based interventions that will help kind of avert the crises that they're outlining. So we need to merge foresight research with evidence-based analysis of levers of change. We talk about a red team approach. Peter Singer wrote a Substack piece a couple of weeks ago outlining the need for a red team approach in health, which is basically where you have a challenge function built into your bureaucracy. And we also need to ensure that the bureaucracy embraces technology, such as artificial intelligence, recognizing it as a tool, not a substitute for expert analysis. We talk about multilateral reform. Canada Canada works better internationally when multilateral institutions are stronger. So it's in Canada's interest to help ensure that multilateral institutions are able to navigate the dramatic drop in funding that many of them are experiencing. So Canada really should seize this opportunity to influence these reforms to build a more efficient and effective multilateral system. We talked about a Team Canada approach where Canada should strengthen coordination and collaboration mechanisms here at home, but also in recipient countries, adopt a Team Canada approach there. So in one of our focus group discussions, they talked about how, participants talked about how often Canadian organizations working in the same context don't know what each other's doing. And so one thing that we talked about in the report is maybe having a central hub, not in the embassy, but a central hub outside that can include networking opportunities where certain organizations like IDRC, FinDev, Grand Challenges, et cetera, can be co-located. We talk about enhancing collaboration through partnerships, consortiums, as well as communities. So where possible, Canada should work with others, including national organizations, to identify and address specific development and humanitarian challenges. So through these mechanisms, data can be more widely shared and gaps in capacity can be identified and filled. We talk about research networks within our report, and I wouldn't be a good researcher if I wasn't shilling for for more funding. And one of the things that I find really interesting, if I compare working in Ottawa to I've worked in the UK, I do some work in Sweden, and I was recently in Washington. I find that the policy community doesn't engage academics to the same degree as it does in other places. And I think that that's a loss. It's a loss for researchers, and it's also a loss for policymakers. So research networks and technical expertise need to be integrated into our approaches in global engagement. And finally, we need to ensure that Canadians are informed of development assistance. So Canadians' understanding of the development environment is often constrained and filtered through only very kind of emotive fundraising appeals. And they don't really understand the true impact as well as the opportunities for Canada that emerge through this engagement. And then finally, we identify some initiatives in the report. And again, these are just an effort to get the conversation started. So first, we argue that Canada should prioritize civilian safety in the humanitarian development peace nexus. The norms that safeguard the protection and well-being of civilian populations in situations of violence are under siege, and we see this every day. I work on attacks against healthcare, and we're seeing a dramatic and troubling increase in attacks against healthcare, not just in Gaza, but in many other contexts. Working with humanitarian organizations, as well as Canada's military, Canada should really push for a renewed focus on the protection of civilians. And I should note that there's a new report on the protection of civilians due to the Secretary General sometime this week. Second, peace building. In a world focused on international security, the world needs countries to also champion peace building. Canada can help revitalize peace building by working with like-minded countries and partners to support peace processes, including through the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. We can coordinate targeted expert deployments to build capacity for peace processes, and we can support nationally led development in conflict management. So one of our participants also mentioned the important role that Canada could play in mediation. People have been talking about this for a long time, but we could strengthen our existing mediation capacity by funding mediation research, but also funding Canadian mediators to go and participate in some of these peace processes. We talked about the importance of an ecosystem for development. One thing that we talk about in the report is the potential for expanding the grand challenges approach beyond health to other challenges, but ensuring that that takes place within recipient countries, where you bring together the public sector, civil society actors, advocates, researchers, to develop and financing, to develop kind of an ecosystem that can really respond more flexibly to these kinds of development challenges. We argue that Canada's leadership in health and education must be sustained and deepened. In conflict-affected settings, we can explore opportunities to implement scalable education and health programming, and as well as promoting innovation, and again, led from the community. And finally, trade and development. This came up in several of our focus group discussions, where Canada could expand its existing initiatives and networks, particularly when the trading system is under threat, to kind of deepen our involvement and support for trade. Initiatives could include better collaboration between trade and development officers working in Canadian missions overseas, an expansion of trade facilitation activities with the purpose not necessarily of increasing Canada's economic growth, but really focusing on small and medium-sized enterprises within these countries. So that really wraps up the focus of our report. So again, this is an opportunity for us to spur conversation, and I'm looking forward to the comments afterwards. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening, and especially to those who participated in the focus group discussions. Your insights were really valuable, and we're deeply grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, Val. I'm now going to invite the panel up to explore some of the issues that Val has put on the table. So I'm asking them all to join me up on stage here, led by Kate Higgins, who is the CEO of Cooperation Canada, who's going to be our moderator. Come on up, the rest of you. Who's going to take us through the discussion, and I'm very happy to introduce very, very briefly the rest of our panelists. Teddy Sammy is the director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University and a professor there. Chinelo Agom-Eze is a senior policy advisor at Canadian Food Grains Bank. Robert Greenhill is the executive chair of Global Canada and a former CETA president. And Louise Holt is a former longtime official at Global Affairs Canada and CETA. So really delighted that you've all agreed to join us, and over to Kate to take us through the conversation.
Thank you so much, Kalin, and hello to many familiar faces. Thank you, Val and NPSIA, for putting together such a fantastic and thought-provoking report for us all. Deeply grateful for all the hard work, and also to the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada for always providing this amazing and really important space for us to connect and think and reflect on the future of Canada's development and humanitarian engagement. We have a wonderful panel here. We have plenty of time for conversation. I will be asking them a number of questions, and I hope it can be a kind of free-flowing discussion, and there'll be an opportunity for many of you and people online to ask questions at the end. Just maybe one reflection to kick us off, which is we know, in a moment of deep global disruption geopolitically with significant implications for the international cooperation. And I'm specifically not saying international aid, but the international cooperation space. And it's critically important for us to have spaces like this, to do the necessary sense-making and reflection so that we are able to chart a way forward together. So, with that, let us get started. We have this fantastic report. I know that all of us on this stage have had the opportunity to take a look at this. And so let's kind of start with the higher level question, which I think many of us who are engaged more closely in advocacy have been reflecting on very deeply over the last 6 months in the context of a federal election and deepening polarization globally and here in Canada, which is, why does it matter? Why should Canada engage in contexts of development, fragility, and conflict? What's the rationale in this context? As other countries retreat, what is the case that we should be making as to why Canada should step up? And in the context, a very real context of fiscal restraint, challenging relationships with our closest economic and political ally and neighbour, how do we make the case to Canadians that this is vitally important? So Teddy, let's start with you. Make the case for us. Yeah. Over to you.
Thank you for the easy question. But before I do that, let me thank Val for her leadership in getting this report done and convening people, bringing people together at the Norman Paterson School. It was very productive, I have to say, to talk about development. As I was saying to Kate earlier, I think we have a real gap in Ottawa and even in Canada when it comes to development issues. So that's my personal view. If I look back a few years ago, I think we've lost a lot in terms of what we used to do in this city and beyond. I think the report makes a pretty compelling case. I think it's naive to think that we can retreat and expect things to get better. The problem when the US retreats, of course, the problem is that when the US retreats and others follow, the problems don't go away. And we know this through many, many examples. If we look at failed states or collapsed states or fragile states, Afghanistan, Mali, Haiti, just to name a few, this is what happens when you don't pay attention to what's going on. And I think the problem with this approach is that at some point, it comes back to haunt you. And we see this all the time. Refugees, we end up spending a lot more on trying to fix problems instead of trying to prevent them. I'm not saying it's easy to do that. So that's one example, I think. The other issue, I think, is to really think about public investments. And you know, the report talks about values and interests. But ultimately, what aid does is that it's a global public investment in public goods or global public goods, however you want to call it. And I think if we frame it this way, then we get into a very different situation, which is that this idea of billions to trillions that was, you know, proposed by the World Bank and many others several years ago has simply not worked out. I mean, we have countless examples and a mounting amount of evidence that this was really a fantasy. It just doesn't work that way. So if the idea is that we're going to leverage public finance for private investments, I'm not against it. In fact, I've written with one of my co-authors in the audience that there are some places where this works really well, and you can leverage it and you can create an incentive structure, but it's not a substitute for public finance. It doesn't work this way because private actors are not going to fill all the gaps. And what you see several years after 2015 is that the private finance that was promised has simply not happened. So you need public investments. Now, we live in a very fiscally constrained environment, and everybody knows that. And so that means we need to start thinking about how we can do this more efficiently. The third point I would make is that we also need to tell Canadians that we actually don't spend as much as they think. You know, yes, it's billions of dollars, but it's a fraction of what we spend in our budget. It's 1 to 2%, I think, of the annual budget. It's 0.34, whatever it is, of the gross national income. If you divide it up by the number of Canadians, it's actually not a lot of money when you think about it. Now, we understand that this is a tough time, but let's assume we keep it the way it is, or at least we should have a calendar, some kind of timetable about where we're going. No one has any idea. We have one in the case of defense. Whether we meet that remains to be seen, but in the case of development, we don't have it. And then we need to tell the story, I think. This is one area where many of the people who came to these meetings said to us, we do a lot of amazing things, but no one knows about it, right? And so why are we unable, as a group of practitioners or academics or even in policy, in government, why can't we make the case to the Canadian public that we are better off when we spend on development? So I will end with these, and I'm happy to come back to some of them later. Thank you.
Thanks, Teddy. Chinelo, your reflections.
Thank you very much for having me here, and thanks to Val as well for bringing me in. I think I'll just start by saying, simply put, we can't not act. The cost of inaction is too high, and we hear this over and over again, that the cost of inaction is too high. But the thing is, what does that actually mean? If there was anything COVID showed us, like the ripple effects of COVID showed us, if there's anything the tariffs at the moment are showing us, is that we don't live in a bubble, we don't live in isolation. We live in a world where what happens outside affects how we live, how we eat, affects our economy. And so we can't be, let me put it this way, isolationist in thinking that what happens out there remains out there and has no direct implication on our lives now and our lives in the future. To answer your question, there are two ways of looking at this, and this will also pivot to some of the things that Val also said. The one way to look at why Canada should engage is from the moral imperative argument. It's the right thing to do. We have, so we give. One of my colleagues who's in the room recently spoke to one of our supporters at Food Grains Bank, and they got into a conversation about why aid. And the person simply said, we have it, like we deal with our domestic problems, but we also give outside. Why do we have to make a choice between one or the other? And this is a view of an everyday Canadian who we're engaging. There is the sense that it's the right thing to do. And so we don't need to lose that values argument. There's the other side of the argument, which is the enlightened self-interest that Val mentioned, which is around a more prosperous Canada, a stronger Canada. And again, there's nothing wrong with that argument. It's really about how do we make the case. It's about who are we speaking to. So for instance, there's some of our supporters who we speak to and we make this enlightened self-interest argument and it's distasteful. It doesn't resonate with them. But then there's some other people who you could speak to and that's what resonates with them. So it's really about tailoring your message. As Teddy said, it's about telling your story, but telling your story and knowing your audience. Who are you speaking to? Knowing where they come from, what motivates them, and then using that as your hook to be able to bring them in. And when we're speaking to politicians, when we're speaking, we've spent a lot of our time in the last few months actually engaging with a lot of MPs. And if there's anything that's kind of come through, is that we go in as advocates, assuming that they know what we're talking about, assuming that they know the value of this, assuming that they know the value add. We need to make the business case for the unconverted. I think that's the best way to put it. We need to make that case. I'll just wrap up my remarks by saying that there was a recent report that came out, the Global Food Crises Report. And this basically says that 295 million people are experiencing acute food insecurity at the moment. People who are experiencing or at risk of famine, the number right now is higher than the last 7 years combined. These conflicts are, like the issues are not going away. The conflicts are increasing, they're rising. We can't act like these issues don't exist. And so I'll end with a quote that from the foreword of this report. And it says that we can't respond to empty stomachs with empty hands and our backs turned. We need action. And then in speaking to the public, we need to be able to communicate what's the impact of what we're doing? Why are we doing this? Beyond telling the story of aid or cooperation or assistance, it's about what we have done in the past. What has it done? What has it achieved? We're constantly talking about the needs and why people need to give more. But are we telling them what they've given has done? What has it achieved? And I think that's kind of where we need to start in making that case. Thanks.
Thank you, Chinelo. Robert, over to you.
Well, I think the key points have already been made. A couple of points that I just add on. One is the issue of values and self-interest. You know, it's generally and. I mean, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you. Is that a value? Is that out of self-interest? Well, it's kind of both, right? And the same thing about making the world a more just, less miserable, more united place. I mean, it came out of the strong sense of enlightened or constructive self-interest. I mean, I always say, you know, maybe charity begins at home, but security begins abroad, and the two are so closely interconnected. And we look at the Marshall Plan that basically started modern development, and people refer to it as the most altruistic act of American foreign policy. Yes, but it was also the most self-interested act of thoughtful American foreign policy, and Marshall himself was Secretary of State at the time, but he'd been a 5-star Army general, right? He didn't do this to be nice, he did this to be safe. But it was done in such a way, so although it was strategically instrumentalized, it was tactfully thoughtful and progressive and really engaged Europeans in designing their own future and America helping them actualize that. That same approach is as relevant today in other parts of the world as it was in Europe in 1948. So I think we should be comfortable making the case that yes, it is a strategic instrument for Canada, but it can be done in a way that works with and through the peoples that we're engaging with. And I think, particularly in today's world when there's such a focus on security, does anybody believe we can break our way to peace? I mean, have we done so well over the last 20 years through foreign military interventions that we think we don't need the instrument of development? We know that these two are connected, and Kofi Annan said it very well, that you cannot have long-term security without development, you cannot have development without long-term security, and you can't have ongoing prosperity without justice and human rights. And I think what we need to make sure is that Canada continues to project that thoughtful, integrated, strategic approach to its international engagement. And I think this report does a wonderful job of helping putting that forward.
Thank you, Robert. Louise, if we can go to you around kind of making the case, but I'd be particularly interested in your reflections on the feminist international assistance policy, in Canada's deep and long-standing expertise and convening power around gender equality. You were a huge leader for many of us and a really critical voice within government around the critical importance of gender equality in Canadian leadership. So your reflections.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Does that sound okay for everybody? Thanks for that. You know, this is such a multi-layered conversation, and we could talk. I could talk a long time about my reflections on Canada's role in leadership and gender equality. But maybe let me, as I'm listening to everybody and having listened to Val's presentation and read the report, let me pivot a little bit more kind of from an instrumentalist perspective. Because certainly I think Canada has played a huge role long before the FIAP in advancing gender equality and women's human rights and making the case for that and the importance of that in achieving all of what we've been talking about here in terms of a peaceful and prosperous world for Canada and for all. And the FIAP was really, it was a pivoting point, and I think, or a pivot point for us. And arguably we're at another pivot point right now in very different contexts, unfortunately. But nonetheless, it was a pivot point. And so if you think back to the time that the FIAP was launched, you know, Canada, despite that long-standing leadership on gender equality and advancing women's human rights, at that point in time, only 3% of Canada's bilateral development assistance was directly benefiting women and girls, projects that directly were aiming to benefit women and girls. And I think that was a bit of a shock to all of us. I mean, I think kind of Canada was a leader in this area. Surely we're doing a lot of work. And when we looked at it, we actually hadn't done that much. And we didn't have a really strong, robust framework or even a clear, you know, as Val said, sort of clear direction on what does that mean for our development assistance. We're also in the global context where, despite global commitments around through the MDGs and subsequently the SDGs to advancing gender equality, had really made little progress. And I think what the FIAP did is it came in with some clear objectives and targets, that clear vision and directive. There's lots of debate around those targets, whether they were the right ones or not. But there was a clear direction to move from that 3% to 15% of all of our bilateral development aid directly benefiting women and girls, and to ensure that not just gender equality sort of mainstreaming or a gender lens was applied to all our programming, but that we had explicit results and targets around gender equality in 80% of Canada's bilateral development aid. At the time as well, we knew that the world needed to start thinking differently about development. We needed to crowd in new funders and new actors, and we hadn't done a very good job at that to date. We hadn't worked well with the private sector despite multiple attempts. We had, including recruiting them into our bureaucracy from the private sector. Not that that was an example of doing well, but we didn't have long-standing sustainable partnerships with private sector, with philanthropy, and I think arguably even with, you know, with the broader Canadian development ecosystem as a whole. But certainly we had not made very many steps into to advancing a localization sort of agenda, despite having really clear and growing evidence that that's where the real change happens, is when you actually work in support of local actors to implement what they know they need and is going to work for them for a sustainable development trajectory. At the time, we were hard-pressed to find any direct funding to local organizations. Fast forward 5 years, relatively short period of time, 15% of our ODA was going towards gender-specific programming. We had surpassed the 80% target of gender equality results being integrated into all of our programming. And Canada was the global leader in funding women's rights organizations, primarily through two relatively small initiatives, Equality Fund and Women's Voice and Leadership. Both of which were ultimately working to support local women's organizations and movements on the ground through two very different approaches. One that was a more traditional working on the ground with local women's organizations. The other that was doing it through an independent, standalone consortium sort of approach, crowding in resources, new partnerships, and new approaches. And I think huge lessons from both of those experiences, and huge lessons from the 5 years that got us to that point where those were up and running. Behind that was a constant effort and a requirement to really pivot, really rethink how we, and I say we as like sort of the Canadian development ecosystem does development. And behind it was a lot of really great collaboration, thoughtfulness inside global affairs, yes, but really largely outside. I mean, I think the entire Canadian development sort of community, Canadian CSOs, Cooperation Canada, you know, many of you in this room, certainly Khalil and your whole organization, you know, just super thoughtful about how we can change, what needs to happen. And it needed to change at every level. The business model at Global Affairs, from our funding model, our budgeting approach, our accountability, our reporting, results reporting, our evaluation approach. We implemented a new feminist evaluation model, particularly under Women's Voice and Leadership. Our partnership approach, how we work, how we bring in finance, how we bring in private sector. And that really is, I think, is something that a lot of people were super skeptical about our ability to do. And at the beginning, I think, of this whole process, lots of people, and including within government, were saying, you know, can't do it, not going to get there. But we did get there. And I think that is a lot, and thanks to that real creativity, dedication, thoughtfulness. I think a lot of Canadian CSOs also changed their internal processes as well, and ended up pivoting and really coming up with different approaches to how they work, including to advance a localization agenda, looking at what the role of Canada and Canadian CSOs are in that kind of new world and in a new development world, and what that looks like. You know, and so again, important lessons learned, I think, for me, and as I'm saying this, and why I'm saying it from that sort of instrumentalist perspective, is that it really can, I do believe that it can be done, and that we can do it, and we can pivot. You know, you can kind of teach an old dog new tricks. But it does take that kind of collaboration and thoughtfulness going forward, as we are seeing here, you know, and sort of welcome views. I think a couple of other sort of quick comments and moving forward. You know, another important element of that, though, was also really driven, focused leadership at the highest levels. There was just a consistent push that this was going to happen. The government wanted it to happen, and it was going to happen. And I think, you know, Robert, you probably agree that was a similar situation with Canada's, you know, big flagship health initiative around health and reproductive health, women and children's health as well, where there was just really focused leadership. And I think that's an important lesson that we need to keep in sight. And, you know, again, speaks, Val, to your having that clear vision and a clear direction of kind of where we're going. As a last point, I think, you know, Teddy, fully agree, communications, and I think that's is really important, how we communicate to Canadian. I think that was probably one of the biggest failures of the FIAP. I think that we, and the government, I say we, I was as part of that at the time, the government, no longer with the government, but I think within government, and perhaps as a Canadian community, always struggled to communicate what the FIAP meant for Canada's development and foreign policy engagement. and to tell that story. I think that in particular, it was seen as sort of on the flip side, and just to put it out, I think a lot of people thought that the focus on gender equality and investments in women and girls was done to the exclusion of men and boys, and to the exclusion of a lot of the work that we've done in traditional sectors of education, health, governance, economic growth. I think that despite a clear policy statement that did try to articulate that, we sort of got stuck on that message. I think going forward, it's clear that there are a number of groups that feel that they were not included in the FIAP framework, and that it was something that was not relevant to them. I think going forward, the lessons learned, the progress that was made under that do need to be picked up on, but I think we clearly need to reimagine sort of not just what our engagement is, but what does, really reimagine what a feminist approach looks like and what advancing gender equality looks like in a way that people understand, that feels inclusive and engaging of men and boys and across all of our development partners.
Thank you, Louise. So some really useful reflections, kind of from a kind of framework, making the case, some lessons from the FIAP. And maybe just a reflection from me is I do think that in this moment, like, there is a risk that we're a little too Canadian and polite and incremental in the way that we're actually grappling with the really significant changes that we're seeing in the world. I think it's also critically important for us to be kind of sense-making in these incredible spaces, but also really taking the opportunity to learn from and listen to a lot of the global conversations happening in this space around the future of the international cooperation system, what that means, what the communities that are really on the front lines of this work are kind of expecting of organisations that are part of the Cooperation Canada membership, the Canadian government, Canada in this moment. And so I think it's critical for us to reflect on that, and for us to be thinking, how are we connecting with those global conversations? How are we making sure that we're leveraging the kind of best practice, the thought leadership, the practice leadership around what is the future of the international cooperation system? The status quo has gone. It has gone. And so it's our responsibility to really be thinking about, okay, what does that mean and what are the next steps? So it's in that spirit that I ask the next set of questions, which is really transitioning to the how. In this context of deep disruption, in this context of demands for change, I'm very curious to know, what are your perspectives on how a country like Canada should engage? How can we humbly maximize our contribution in a thoughtful way? And are there particular approaches, ideas, initiatives that you have been inspired by from the report or otherwise that you think we should be pushing for? And I would encourage us to kind of think about, what is that disruption? Are there lessons that we can draw on? Are there initiatives that we should be inspired by? So a really kind of a transition from the kind of the why to some concrete ideas on the how, and not all of your ideas, but really kind of forcing us to think very concretely, how can we leverage this moment and what can that look like? So let's start with you, Teddy. What have you got?
So when I was thinking about this question, I was also thinking about the next question on the list, which is the foreign policy review. What I think we should try to do, at least if we do a review or we think about how we engage, is to really have a clear roadmap with realistic goals, given the level of financing that we have, right? So the question doesn't say what limited means. I mean, is it less? Is it significantly less? Is it the same amount? But regardless, I think what this says is essentially that we need to match our level of ambition with the financial capacity that we have. I don't think we should be over-promising as we have done in the past, because it just creates a really strange environment where people expect a lot, but nothing happens, right? It reminds me of some of the conversations we're having at the university right now, which is that we can't be everything for everyone, because universities, as you know, are also facing financial challenges in Canada. So I think this is a good way to think about it.
I guess this will start again the conversation about, for those of us who've seen this before, about countries of focus, or do we focus on sectors, or which ones, and so on. But regardless of how we do this, I think we are at that point in time where we have to have that conversation, right? Where do we put our resources if they are limited, where we can have the most impact? In terms of concrete things, I mean, part of it, which I noticed when we had these different meetings, is that obviously people come to the table with their own research agendas or their own preferences because they work in particular sectors, so, you know, health or education and so on. But I think one thing that is interesting from some of the work that we did many years ago and even now to look at, you know, try to get countries to become less dependent on foreign aid because they are not going to receive the same amount of resources. So one thing where there has been a lot of work done, but I think more work can be done, is to help countries mobilize resources domestically, right? So, you know, small investments in building tax systems, for example, in developing countries can help them not be as dependent as they used to be. I think in the Canadian case, there's one thing that's really striking, which kind of flew under the radar last year, but it goes to this idea of policy coherence, where Canada says one thing and does the opposite. So there's this international convention that the UN has been trying to get to push forward on tax cooperation. Canada was one of 8 countries, right, that voted against it, with the US, the UK, and a few other countries. Why? So this convention, the goal is to try to help countries deal with this issue of illicit financial flows that affects many countries in the developing world, where they lose billions of dollars, and also the issue of tax evasion and tax havens, where if we were able to even get some of that work done to close these loopholes, it would significantly outweigh some of the aid money that actually gets sent to these countries. So why did Canada not vote for this, right? Begs the question. One of 8 countries in the world to oppose this, for whatever reason, right? And so now the convention, all the other countries voted for it, and now the discussion is happening. And in February or March of this year, I think there was one meeting, and the US walked out, right? So, of course, we know why. But I think this is an example that comes to mind when I say policy coherence, or at least matching what we say with what we do, I think is something we need to be more careful about. The other thing I would also say is, given the issue of rising debt levels, which I think you mentioned in the report, which is significantly affecting low-income countries, and the fact that these countries now face a very different situation from the time when HIPC was around in the 90s, when most of the debt was public. Now a lot of the debt is not concessional, it's private. China is also involved in this. But these countries also have to finance development, finance the SDGs, pay the debt, and also find money to adapt to climate and so on. So it's a very complicated issue, which obviously they can't do. I think Canada can play a larger role there in terms of convening groups to figure out how to resolve the debt crisis in many of these countries, or potential debt crisis. And I will end on one thing again, which is sort of a concrete thing that I think can happen a lot more, which is the power of the multilateral development banks to leverage money. So, you know, I don't know what the ratio is today, but it's significant. And if you look at the balance sheet of these MDBs, they're significantly undercapitalized. So they actually don't leverage as much money as they could, and yet they are a sure bet, so they can raise significantly more funding and provide it at concessional levels to these countries that are facing high levels of debt. If they don't do this, for those of us who've studied this for many years, we know what will happen. The same situation that happened in the late 1990s or mid to late 90s will happen. Countries will default. And then we're going to have to reschedule or find ways again to finance it. So I think these are concrete examples where I think Canada, with its convening power, as the report mentions, and the fact that we work really well at the multilateral level, can actually leverage our knowledge and our resources to actually accomplish something very concrete that will actually pay off for some of these countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Teddy. Really, really thoughtful for us to be really thinking about this policy coherence issue. And I think as finance ministers are meeting in Banff this week, as we look towards the 4th International Conference for Financing for Development happening in Seville over the summer in Spain, I think really important for us to be thinking about that. And that's certainly some work that we've been advocating for through our work on the G7 process. Okay. Let's flip back to Louise and then come back this way. I'm going to ask you to be really concrete. Just give me an idea, and the three of you to give me one idea on how. What is the how that you think we should be thinking about as Canada in this context right now? Louise.
Well, I'm going to, again, maybe flip completely to the other end of the spectrum from what Teddy was just speaking about, and go back to the issue of localization. I think it would be a shame if some of the gains and progress that have made in recent years were lost. I think in that landscape, Canada and Canadian the Canadian development community has really gained a lot of credibility and a lot of, a really strong record for having moved the needle in terms of how we actually work with local organizations. I can go back again to Women's Voice and Leadership and the Equality Fund. We're really good testing grounds for that. And I think a couple of big myths around that. One that, both on gender equality, but also, making change at the local level, making changes in gender equality, bringing about transformative gender equality results takes time, maybe is even a multi-generational kind of issue. And that is not what we saw. We saw with very small investments that in support of local organizations, they were able to make huge change and to do it really quickly. So changes in, legislative change, policy change at the national level, increased participation of women, in economic activities through more effective cooperative movements, or increasingly sort of pushing on those fronts. But we also saw that we also continue to see that local organizations and local women's rights organizations are really at the front line of response to crisis, humanitarian crisis, but conflict as well, and are able to be there and pivot and respond and support their communities in those times of crisis. And so providing support and working with them, irrespective of kind of the sector, and allowing them to decide sort of what is needed, but supporting them to build on a mini Marshall Plan kind of model, I think can really have a big impact and is an area where I think Canada, without a lot of money, can play an important leadership role. And maybe one last comment to say again is a really interesting lesson learned. Both of those initiatives, there was a clear decision not to mandate what sectors the money would flow to. We were allowing women's rights organizations or movements to come to us or to the Equality Fund to say, we need money to support our mandate working in this area. 5 years on, when we did the analysis, for the most part, we found that organizations were working across all sectors and working across our traditional sectors. The one area perhaps where there was a lack of funding, and I think, you said one thing, I'm saying localization, but I really think we need to look at what that looks like in the context of our funding for humanitarian crisis and conflict, and I think will be hugely relevant in the current context and as this government is going forward, and how we move that forward. And I know that many of the organizations in this room will have some really great ideas about how we can do that, and are maybe already doing it in many ways on the ground. We're just not capturing it.
Thank you so much, Louise, for talking about that. And I do think that there are important lessons for us to gain from initiatives like Women, Voice and Leadership, and thinking about how could we scale that across the aid portfolio, across a range of areas. And I think, to really name it, I think for organizations that are in the Canadian civil society space, many who are members of Cooperation Canada, are a real obligation on us to really reimagine what our role is in a system where we do need to shift power, we do need to move move money, we do need to shift decision making. And so I think we often talk about the need for the government and global affairs to change their ways of working so we're able to move money in a much faster, more efficient way. And just to name that, it's also the responsibility of Canadian organizations who are part of this ecosystem to think very carefully about what is our role and how can we reimagine our contribution to global cooperation in a very disrupted and changed environment. Robert, let's turn to you. What's your one idea?
So the one idea is basically focus, follow through, and clear commitment to outcome results, not just process results. And the manifestation of that would be a tight geographic focus where Haiti is going to be the critical test. If we don't actually step up and lead in Haiti, we're not leading, because we don't matter in 90% of developing countries. We matter there. The second manifestation of it would be, do we really put our focus on helping countries improve state effectiveness, including civil society leadership, like women's voice and leadership as part of building effective states that can provide services and protect citizens? And the third, do we really follow through on Canada's increasing leadership in elements of global health, particularly on women and children's health? And can we come up with language and approaches that de-weaponizes it and makes it broadly acceptable across the different partisan groups in Canada? Because it's really now 20 years of leadership, but we need to be able to sustain it. If we can do those three things, we can really have an impact, and we can hold ourselves accountable for it.
Thank you. Very brief, very targeted, and very, very helpful. And I know that many of us in this room have been reflecting a lot around polarization and closing civic space, and what that means not only in the context of human rights work and human rights defenders, but what that means in the context of kind of the large spectrum of work that we're engaging in around international cooperation. Okay, Chinelo, what's your idea?
My one idea. Okay, for people who know me in the room, everyone knows my one idea, Nexus. We need to, so based off of the work that Food Grains Bank has done in the past, so there's evidence for this, that we shouldn't be thinking about our development assistance or humanitarian assistance in silos. One informs the other. A lot of crises around the world are protracted. They're not the cut and dry humanitarian crises we once had that spanned 6 months, a year, and we were done. Now we have humanitarian crises spanning years, and we can name a lot of these contexts. So how do we move people from reliance on humanitarian assistance to building that resilience through development assistance, supporting peace-building activities in contexts where those are needed? And there's evidence for this. Global Affairs had a pilot project called the Humanitarian Early Recovery Development Project. So there are lessons learned, and there were a number of organizations who took part in this. What have we done to distill those? What has Global Affairs done to distill those learnings and try and see how it could be translated across different lines? And just to go to the point that Teddy made about policy coherence, we signed on to the OECD DAC Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus framework. What have we done to actually actualize this? The things we signed on to, what have we done to kind of put it into action?
Very clear, one idea. It's something that many of us have been advocating for. How do we ensure that we're able to kind of program around a range of different contexts when those contexts are changing so quickly? We have time for one final question, and then we're coming to all of you. And kind of there's two issues to kind of cover here, so decide how briefly you would like to respond. We've spoken a little bit about this. There was in the election platform of the Liberal Party, now our government, a commitment to a full foreign policy. I think many of us welcomed that and welcomed the need for Canada to have a coherent and very clear foreign policy. So your thoughts on kind of what this means for development and how we can really ensure that development is integrated into a Canadian foreign policy in a coherent way. And then, are there some really concrete ways that we can use Canada's leadership, Canada's engagement in the world. There was a concrete example in the report around a G7 working group on development and humanitarian action. Other ideas around how we can leverage Canada's leadership in this moment of disruption to be kind of an active player in how we reimagine this global cooperation system. So final thoughts. Let's go this way. Teddy.
Can we go this way?
Sure, Louise, go for it. We'll finish with you. Just some brief kind of final thoughts
Okay,
to
yeah,
wrap us up, and then
yeah.
we'll go to the audience.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm gonna go back in some ways to where I started, but with a sense. I think that we have, I say we again, as part of sort of the Canadian development community, and I spent sort of a majority of my career, sort of almost 30 years working in this space. And over those 30 years, I think in many ways, progress and change was slow. We tend to get stuck in our ways and our vision and very strong beliefs about how things should be done and how we work. And I think, what you just outlined, Kate, as well, for everybody to, I think build on some of the lessons of knowing that we can do to really reimagine what is the role of development within that broader foreign policy framework. How does it link into a current global context where there aren't clear divides between sort of development, conflict, humanitarian, where you're seeing those traditional lines and rules being blurred. I mean, Val talked about the healthcare workers and the threats that they're under. I think really does force us to rethink things. And I guess just inviting people to do that from a place of their knowing. I do think that was one of our big experiences, when we talked to people and did a lot of the talking about how we do things differently with the Equality Fund, with Women's Voice and Leadership. That knowledge was there. I think it was there on the ground in terms of local partners knowing what they needed, but also a lot of our colleagues and our teams around what kind of responses would best support communities and ultimately, a broader, more safe and peaceful societies as a whole. So it's sort of more of a challenge to people that we can do things differently, and let's think about how that would look.
Thanks, Louise. Robert.
Yeah, I guess, first of all, I would hope we use it in the process to really ensure we're engaging with the leaders and the peoples of the South to understand what they in 2025 are looking for from us and what they're not looking for from us. Secondly, just as I believe development is a strategic instrument of foreign policy, the other departments are strategic instruments for development policy. So if we need to go into a fragile or conflict affected state, and we need the Canadian Armed Forces or we need public security to get involved, I hope we don't see the same kind of a rejection of that responsibility that we saw when the former Prime Minister Trudeau tried to engage Canadian Armed Forces to do something in Haiti, when our Prime Minister had made a commitment to the President of the United States we would do something. And basically, in Ottawa, we blocked that. So where we have development priorities, all the different departments should be working with global affairs to make it happen. And then thirdly, I also hope whatever we do is really designed to responsibilize and support and provide leadership to Southern actors, whether it's civil society actors, development actors, or government actors, so we really can show how we're making ourselves redundant in more and more places over the next 10 to 15 years.
Thank you, Robert. Chinello.
Thanks, Kate. So as Val mentioned when she was talking about what the report covers, the report actually highlights quite a number of key focus goals, mechanisms and initiatives that the government can take on board. But just to kind of jump on Robert's point, during our advocacy in the lead up to the election, we were talking about the 3 Ds and a T. So that's defense, diplomacy, development, and trade. These we can't think of one in isolation of the other. For a comprehensive foreign policy, these are core pillars that we need to kind of rest on. And for one to be missing would be to not have an effective foreign policy. The Liberal platform highlights and gives some ideas around what would be focused on. So they talk about maintaining humanitarian assistance. There's a reference to strengthening FinDev in terms of innovative financing. There is an allusion to climate finance and also women gender responsive programming as well as increasing our diplomatic presence. But and this report can actually feed into a lot of these areas that the Liberal platform spoke about. But two areas that I would say that we need to ensure are included in whatever document comes through from the government is one, that relationship between the local, the national, and the international, and how they all work together. We live in an interconnected space. Louise has been talking about localization. Through Grains Bank, we know the importance of localization and working through local actors. But we also know the importance of working alongside our international partners as well. And so we can't do one to the detriment of the other. And then the second piece goes to another point that Louise made earlier on around the public engagement. We need to build in a public engagement strategy into whatever foreign policy review we're going, that's going to be put forward. We need to include in there something that talks about how we're going to communicate to the public about what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're going to do this, and also get their buy-in. And I think maybe that would help, I guess.
Thank you, Chinelo. Teddy.
That's why I wanted to hear everybody first, just to see where we would go. I think I'd like to go back to the first point that I made a while ago, which is we really need to be less ambitious, and I don't know how to frame this, but we clearly do not have a lot of resources that will be spent over the next few years. So I think telling people that this is what we have and this is what we can accomplish, and telling them what it is, as opposed to promising a lot of things, is what I would say, personally, a foreign policy review should do. I hope it's quick, and it doesn't end up with many consultations, but we have a roadmap. It matches with how much we want to spend and how much we want to engage. And maybe not all of it requires as many as resources, but I think we should be very clear that this is what we can do, and these are the goals and objectives, and let's try to do those, as opposed to trying to do everything at the same time, because we've seen this before. And I think, to go back to Robert's point about the Global South, having spoken to many people in those countries over the years, we are becoming less and less, let's say, hopeful that Canada will do something, because clearly we're not serious when it comes to these things. We take too long, and whatever comes out is clearly not good enough in many cases. And since we haven't really talked about it, I will mention it as a final comment, which is the Canada-Africa strategy. That took forever to actually come out, and yes, we have it now, but there's no resource commitment whatsoever behind it. So that's a good example of what I think we should try to avoid doing in the future. Let's be realistic, and let's not overpromise and underdeliver.
So I just want to strongly agree and disagree, in the sense that I think we should be much more focused. I think we should be much more ambitious where we focus. And I think we should be much more courageous, both in and outside the government, to accomplish the commitments we set for ourselves in those focused areas.
I agree.
Okay.
Well,
So thank you for a really, really insightful conversation. Now we want to hear from you folks. So please keep questions brief, introduce yourself, and let's get started. Please, Ben.
Thanks very much for a great discussion and a great report. Last year, our ODA was at 10.1 billion. 40% went to multilateral organizations, bilateral aid via NGOs and contractors, 35%, direct government-to-government aid, 15 to 20%. A fair amount of what's called in-Canada spending. That's international assistance that's spent domestically, primarily on refugee support refugees during their first year. If you look at that distribution, it really hasn't changed very much over the decades. And given the huge knock right now on multilateral organizations with the withdrawal of US AID funding, which, by the way, is being replaced to some extent by the Chinese. They announced today $500 million for WHO. Some of you might have seen that report. Is that the right mix? Would you change it? Should we spend more on the multilateral system, which is under attack? Should we let others pick up the slack like the Chinese? Should we be spending more on direct bilateral assistance? Haiti, by the way, is not in the top 10 countries, if you look at the list.
Thank you very much. We are going to take a few questions. So let's go to 2 here, and then we'll go out the back.
Hi, bonjour. And thank you so much, Robert, for talking about this well-known sentence from Kofi Annan, establishing nexus between international security and international cooperation. And merci, Teddy, for mentioning the African strategy, our first African strategy in Canada. The world has been working about this nexus between international development, international security. I recently spent approximately 20 years on the field in Africa for the United Nations. We have been facing this situation. It has not been resolved. My question to you, what will you mention as 1 to 3 points in order to resolve this situation based on the new strategy? Should we go away from countries where we have war, like Sudan, Congo, or what we did in Burkina Faso? ACTI was there, SIDA was there. When the situation came to the worst, we just left. What should we do concretely? That's the point.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, I'm Taj Al-Khazini. I'm an associate professor at NPSIA. Thank you. Is there political will to act? I think we have a crisis of political will. Are there any wars that are not really our wars? I mean, should we be there wherever bullets are flying? Should we be there, or should we distinguish between what are our wars and what is not our wars? Are we aware, and did the report, the research, take care of the disconnect between us, the older generations, and the under 40? There is a real crisis of connectivity with under 40. The elephant in the room really is to move from the 0.3% of gross domestic product to the 0.75, which is the bar and where the Scandinavian countries are probably the only ones that are honoring that. So the critical mass of aid, the critical mass of funds available are a determinant. Right now, the center of gravity really is Ukraine and Gaza. As my colleague said, what about Sudan? What about South Sudan? What about the Democratic Republic of Congo? I was talking to one of the advisors in the White House about donor fatigue, and he said that we have passed the stage of donor fatigue. We are in compassion fatigue. So my question is, how do we build compassion fatigue first? Because that will determine the donor fatigue. And my last point and question is, before Leslie Nelson went to Geneva, there was an event, and I asked her a question. Leslie, do you think that Canada really understands Africa, as an example? She looked at me, and she knew very well, because we knew each other very well, that she can only tell me the truth. And on the record, she said no. I think we have an issue of basics. We cannot talk about Africa and produce 20 pages report of Canada-Africa strategy. 5 years, as Teddy said, a long time, it was 5 years. 20 pages, I wouldn't pay $1 for it really. And it started as Canada-Africa strategy, then it moved as Canada-Africa framework, then it moved back into Canada-Africa strategy. So I think we need to be serious, we need to cut ourselves to size, and remember that twice in a row, we lost the bid for the seat, the non-permanent seat in the Security Council. So we need to be careful about really our international image.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And just one last question here, and we will have time for one more round. Nick.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to NPSIA, to Val, and to the AKFC for hosting us, and to our panelists. I think this is a fundamental conversation we're having today, and I think we're only just touching on the surface, and I'm really excited for it. I wanted to thank you for all the interventions, and I agree with really everything that's been said. I did want to make a couple of points, though, around where we are at this pivot point, the FIAP, engaging Canadians. And I think one of the things that I just wanted to add to this conversation is that we are seeing more polarization than we have in a long time, and we really do have to acknowledge that. That while as a community we champion gender equality, and we must, and we believe in it deeply, there has been a counter-reaction to some of the language that we've been using in presenting gender equality. And in fact, the FIAP and a lot of the language that pushes us to do better and to push the boundaries of what needs to be done in terms of sharing power better has actually created opposing forces. And I do think it's important for us to acknowledge that in the way that we set ourselves up moving forward, that a lot of the development conversations that we have are very highbrow. We're not bringing people in. We're using language that pushes people away. And we really shouldn't be doing this. We're doing ourselves a big disservice. You know, fundamentally, our work is about alleviating poverty. It's about helping people and making for better lives. And we don't talk in those terms. We should be talking in those terms. I feel so very strongly, and we're seeing a lot of that from our supporters at CUSO and the way that they're reacting to us. Our supporters are telling, some of them, very few, but some of them are telling us Canada should stop giving international assistance. And what does that mean? You know, how do we process that? And so I think this question of how we engage Canadians has to also force us to come back to basics in many respects. And I wanted to just posit something, that as we consider how we move forward and think about the future of development assistance for Canada, everything that we do in some way or form ties into some form of capacity building. And you can use different language for it, technical assistance. You can, whether that's Women's Voice and Leadership, the Equality Fund, whether that's direct assistance, whether that's with governments or civil society or private sector, we're building capacity. And I think of the ODA Accountability Act and our commitments there. I think of our localization commitments. You know, we really should be working towards stopping direct program delivery from the north. And so I actually think as a frame, we should be centering these things, that we have value add in capacity building, use whatever terms you want in that. And that we should be more explicit about that. I finally just want to say to something you raised, actually, Kate, and this is my question to the panel, is these are big topics. There are so many risks of us always diluting a clear direction for our programming as a country. How do we coalesce around bold choices? How can we create the winning conditions for this very diverse community that we are in international development to actually align? And there's no shortage of good ideas for what we need to do, no shortage of sectors that need support. But we have to make those decisions somewhere at that Venn diagram overlap of the right thing to do, our own capacity and national interest. So how can we create the winning conditions for political masters that be, whatever political stripes they have, to actually see that there's consensus, there's a drive towards bold and ambitious change?
Thank you very much. And in the interest of doing things differently and being disruptive, we are not coming to you yet. We are going to keep the conversation happening with the audience. There's some really great interventions. It's really excellent to hear from all of you. So please, hands up who would like to come next. Temrese, please. Others, just hands up so I can see. Wonderful, thanks.
Thank you. My name's Temrese Khan, and I'm sort of just going to follow up with Nick's comments. My work is clearly focused on the Global South, coming from the Global South myself. And there are two levels of, I guess, engagement with the Global South, talking about them leading the way, quote unquote. One is with Global South governments, and the other is with Global South civil society, and they both exist on very different levels. Civil society is more rights-based. Governments are not in the Global South. And so that level of engagement for Canada would be very different on both those levels. And I think that's something we need to discuss very carefully. And it's also aligned with foreign policy. I'm very much against the idea that development of foreign aid or ODA should be part of foreign policy, because I think the objectives are completely different, and merging the two together is very dangerous, as we've seen in a lot of conflict-affected countries, that aid comes after a conflict begins, which in many cases the northern countries have a lot to contribute to. So I think that's a very careful path that we need to tread. And talking about a foreign policy review, I'd be very interested to see whether aid is in it, why it's in it, and where should it go? So I think that's something I'd be interested to get everybody's opinion on. Just two very quick things. One on FIAP, I think there's a lot of response coming from partners in the Global South on FIAP, that it's a very imposed agenda. That the idea of how countries in the South view gender equality is very different from the way Canada perceives it. And so the fit isn't exactly right. And I think that's something that needs to be seen in terms of any policy that Canada puts out, whether it's gender equality or any other area of work. There needs to be a fit, and if that fit has to come from the Global South, then that's where the policy direction needs to come from. And I think FIAP sort of, didn't exactly make that cut. And lastly, communications, I think also a very tricky sort of direction, because communication for what? To show that Canada is doing a wonderful job, or to show what partnership is actually like. I mean, you have to decide what you're communicating for. Is it to fundraise? Is it because you want more Canadians to give ODA, or it's because you want the government to be convinced that more ODA should be given? I think that's something that really needs to be looked at carefully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Temrese. We have an online question. So who is sharing that? Great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine. I'm with Aga Khan Foundation Canada. So we've had quite a number of questions online centering around the theme of communication to Canadians about international aid and what Canada is doing. Specifically, how to improve our communications to Canadians on the positive impacts of aid, both in recipient countries and in Canada. And also, given the current economic context and the concerns that Canadians have about the cost of living increase, how can we effectively explain the value and necessity of international cooperation to a public that may perceive it as money taken away from vulnerable Canadians?
Thank you very much. And just a show of hands, other questions? Yeah, okay. Someone up the front here, please.
I'm very interested in the question of gathering real results, because you can have great plans and you can have great activities, but if you can't measure the results, you don't really know whether you've made a difference. And I think it's a little easier to gather results on humanitarian aid. You can say how many meals were served, how many people were housed. But development itself, it's often a much more sophisticated thing. And my question would be to all of you people who are practicing in the field now is, do you think we are successfully gathering the kind of data even down to a granular level that can really show whether we're making a difference with our aid and our aid money and our development money.
So, a very rich set of questions. I think one of the only reasons I get asked to do these is because I do always finish on time. And I'd really like to thank everyone for some really fantastic questions. I'm going to go to the panel. I am not expecting you to reflect and answer every question that has been posed. This is a conversation and an opportunity for sense-making for all of us. But I'll just ask you for one reaction from what you've heard, or something you'd like to share to close this out, and then we'll hand it back to Khalil. Let's start with you, Louise.
Yeah, I think, I'll go back and Nick threw it out, and maybe I was being sort of overly polite or too delicate when I was referring to it before, and I think speaks again to that communication to Canadians, a common understanding, a common sense objective. And I think, I fully agree with what Nick was saying, that unfortunately, and maybe, sorry, I've missed the name, Tasmin sort of mentioned around the FIAP not landing. And I think that that agenda, or a sense that it's an agenda that's not inclusive, or that it's being done to the exclusion of men and boys, the reality, I think people are feeling not part of that, and not that isn't an agenda. I think that does reflect, a broader trend that is happening in the world, and is not disconnected from the trend that's happening in the world, where there is a large proportion of the population in many northern countries that are just feeling disenfranchised, and that's being reflected in reduction in ODA and election results. And I think that, again, it really pushes that imperative that we need to really rethink how we are articulating, again, what the value added, and really, goes back to the questions that we've just been grappling with here. But, why is it relevant for everyone and for all Canadians? And but that's being advanced in a way that is inclusive, and that we're not alienating important parts of the population, whether it's in Canada or on the ground locally. I think that notwithstanding, when you look at what's happening in the world, if we want to think about advancing gender equality and women's human rights, continue to be under huge threat, in new ways that we haven't seen before, and in worse ways that we haven't seen before. Women and children continue to be, as if not more vulnerable in those situations. And I do think that it's not the time for Canada to step away from a commitment to that kind of protection and advancement. And also, for, again, just going back to that, for everybody's benefit. We know that everybody benefits when women and girls and half the population community are engaged in making decisions that impact their lives, that are empowered, and they're participating and contributing to their communities and society as a whole. So I don't think it's the time to step away. Is it the time to really rethink how we articulate that? Absolutely.
Thanks. Robert.
Yeah, just one of the observations I've made by a number of the examples people showed is increasingly the countries that are the worse off are worse off because of human action and geopolitics and elite behavior. And if we actually want to make collectively any difference in that, we can't just deal with the symptoms of people are hungry or being attacked. It's like, why are they hungry? Why are they being attacked? Which means dealing with this combination of conflict, corruption, and state capture. And we need to be much more clear-eyed about this. And that's not a very nice space. It's not something development groups are generally comfortable with. It's not the kind of thing our military is comfortable with. And that's therefore why I think we need to focus on a few countries where we are prepared to actually engage and not step back, but step up. That may be Haiti, that may be Ukraine. It may be in one or two of the states in the Sahel if there's a political courage. But I think for us to actually make a real impact at a root cause level in some of these most challenging countries, we have to collectively really change how we're approaching this.
Thanks, Robert. Chinelo.
Some of the comments and reflections that were made all come around the same theme. So the issue around compassion fatigue, increasing polarization, what are we communicating for? Where should aid go? Why should we have aid as part of foreign policy? Really comes to this idea about our articulation about what we're doing, and really around the communication of why and about the why as well. We need to do better, and I keep coming back to this point. We need to do better about talking about the work we do. We need to be able to, so I think someone asked why are we talking to the Canadian public? I don't think we're talking to the Canadian public for us to increase aid. It's really to build on that shared Canadian value and build that general public support for the idea of helping people, and not lean into the polarization that's happening at the moment. We need to do better about talking about the results. So someone mentioned, how do we translate development results? I don't think the results aren't there. It's really how we talk about it. We do all these very big verbose reports to GAC. How are those being translated to the people? How are we telling them that their taxpayers' dollars are being used? I'll just go to the issue of Nexus. When we talk about Nexus, we talk about the efficiency of $8. We talk about the effectiveness and how it builds resilience. What does that actually mean? Being able to translate these terms, these buzzwords, to be able to bring people in. I think that's where we would be able to make that change and make that transition into not only saying what we're doing and doing what we're doing, but actually having backing for it as well.
Thank you. Teddy.
I like the question. The evaluation question is, of course, very interesting. There's been lots of improvements in terms of how evaluations are done, but you're never going to get to a point where you can fully capture what happens, because when do you measure and how far ahead? I think one of the problems with development is that sometimes things happen 10, 15 years later because of something you did before, but you never checked. So I think part of communications, of communicating this, is to actually tell people why this is complicated, right? Some things you can see in terms of health, humanitarian assistance, but others are much more difficult to evaluate. You would have to go back 10, 15 years later, or maybe even more, to see the impact. Like building a road, for example, are people using it, right? So that's for one. The question by my former director, Fen, is really interesting. If we're spending less, which I assume we will, then we will be spending less across the board, right? And there's always going to be that combination of whether you go with NGOs or bilaterally or multilaterally. I think the context matters, because in some cases you can work directly with governments, in others you can't. Mm-hmm. And I think in development we always face that challenge, to go back to Nick's point about technical assistance or capacity building. How do you work with governments that you don't trust? And that's an issue that we deal with all the time, especially in fragile and conflict-affected cases where governance is really an issue. So you're always going to have that problem. I don't think it goes anywhere. But I think we need to go back to the fundamental issue of what are we good at and where do we have the biggest impact. So the report is about moving the needle. If it is multilaterally, then maybe that's what we should be doing more. If it is at the bilateral level in some cases, then we spend more bilaterally. I'll end on one thing. I remember the Dutch did a report, a review of their policy a few years ago, and I really liked the way that they structured it. Because essentially what they did, they put countries in different baskets. And they say, if you're fragile and conflict-affected states, we will deal with you in one way with specific instruments. But if you are further up the chain and you're more advanced and you have better institutions and so on, we can work with you in a different way. So I think that differentiated approach at least gets us somewhere, right? As opposed to having a very vague policy or not a policy at all about how we engage. Because right now, other than the FIAP, I don't know what else we have, right? What's our strategy? Where do we invest? How do we do it? I think it's a political decision most of the time, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists, in thanking NPSIA, in thanking Val and the Aga Khan Foundation.
What a discussion. Thank you to our leaders at NPSIA for agreeing to come to the delegation and to work with AKFC to host this discussion, and more importantly for the initiative to convene the series of discussions you did and summarizing it so pithily today for us. Val, thank you for your leadership of that. Kate, for your deft and very prompt moderation, as always, and to Teddy and Chanello, Robert and Louise for helping us with this discussion, maybe most importantly for the very vibrant conversation that it inspired among the group. And thank you for all of you who have contributed to that, and to many others who I'm sure were ready to kind of get in next, but time didn't allow. Look, it seems to me that this is an opportunity. This time in the political cycle and this time in world affairs is an opportunity for this kind of discussion to shape the way in which Canada thinks about the work ahead. We are confronting the very radically altered conditions everywhere in the world. And the prospect that we might be governed by nostalgia rather than genuine insight for the world that we are now confronting has to be avoided, it seems to me, at all costs. And so with creativity, as well as with, I hope, very strong ethical orientations, we might come together to articulate a series of directions and commitments for this country to contribute to this world at this very, very difficult time. So I am deeply grateful to all of you for joining us in this session. For those of you who are here for the first time, make sure you get on our list for events. It's one of the great privileges that the Aga Khan Foundation Canada has, that we are able to bring people together on issues of common concern. So I hope you'll join us again in the future. There is a QR code that's going to appear on this screen in just seconds from now, which I'll ask all of you to use your phones to get the link. That will lead you to a survey talking about evaluation. And I'm now told quite reliably that if you haven't filled out the survey, some electrical shock will greet you when you pick up a plate for the reception after this. So please do take a few minutes to offer your views and thoughts that will help us shape how this all unfolds. So thank you very much. Please join us now for an informal way to carry on the discussion, and maybe our collective energy and collegiality might even invite the sun to poke through the clouds during this spring in Ottawa. So thank you very much.